Hello everybody and welcome to The First Step, a channel dedicated to providing tutorials on concept art and illustration for artists of every level. If you like what you see, if you've learned something after the end of this video, if you want to see more, please hit the subscribe button and you will get more tips, more tutorials, and more just fun drawings and paintings. My name is Gary Laib and today we will be painting, you guessed it, a pig and a gnome. And we're going to have fun doing it. I just want to start by mentioning that this is one of the many ways to approach an illustration. I myself use several different methods, but it usually just depends on how I feel at that time. So without further ado, let's get started on the rough sketch. The first thing you'll notice is that this video is very sped up. That's because nobody has 5 hours to kill to sit and watch somebody doodle. I've also begun this by putting a gray background down, and I find that this makes starting a painting less intimidating. It sort of feels like you've already started your painting, rather than beginning with a stark white background. The brush that I'm using is a soft, it's a hard round brush with opacity, low opacity, and jitters set to pen pressure so that it's sort of controlled by how hard I press on the Cintiq. So make sure when you start a new sketch or new drawing that you keep it loose and don't be afraid to mess up. You're going to notice a lot of times, and I'm happy to point it out, all the times that I mess up in this piece. It's fun. It's how we learn as artists, and you will eventually come to enjoy those hiccups. So there's going to come a point where I finish the rough sketch and I want to start the refined sketch, and I realize I've picked the wrong brush, the one that I don't normally use to create a refined sketch. But instead of starting over right away, I decide to see where it goes, see if it works out. And I will point out exactly that moment where I realize, no, it's not going to happen. And right about there, nearly done with the sketch, and I'm sort of fighting an uphill battle at this point. So, as I've nearly completed the sort of semi-refined sketch, I decide I gotta start again. So I reduce the opacity on this layer, create a new layer on top of it, and start with the brush that I had originally intended to use. You'll notice that this new brush has more of a refined line to it. It has a lot more control, or I feel like I have a lot more control over it. But I'm able to really get in and noodle out some of the finer details and make a polished, refined sketch for the next step. There's going to be a few times in this video where you see me rotate the canvas, and I have that set up to a hotkey on my Cintiq. I do this frequently. I don't know how frequently I do it in this video, but I do it frequently enough, and it's because I need to get a good angle in order to get the right line weight or the right direction and not make it look like garbage. So keep that in mind when you're drawing or painting. Rotating the canvas, a lot of fun. Puts a different spin on things. Okay, so with the refined sketch of the gnome complete, it's piggy time. I've never drawn a pig, at least not in this instance, and I looked for reference for a nice pot-bellied pig, and for those of you questioning whether or not it's okay to use reference, absolutely. And the reason being is that not every artist knows what everything in the world looks like. So many artists in the gaming industry, in the entertainment industry, they're going to have a folder or a Pinterest account where they've collected references for pigs, for robots, for anything, because you don't know what everything looks like. But as soon as you draw it once, you kind of have that in your memory banks, and then you're able to pull off of that for any future drawings, any future artwork you create. So reference, highly used, especially in the entertainment and video game industry. If you're a concept artist, you probably use reference. Okay, so now that we have the refined sketch complete, we're going to start some of the harder stuff. We're going to do a general blocking of tones, still working in grays, and then start to define our light source and some of the overall shapes of these characters. So I start by setting my opacity, or picking a very painterly brush, something with a little bit of texture to it, but also something that moves pretty smoothly across the digital page. Set it to 100 of opacity, and then just start blocking in on a layer underneath my refined sketch. And what that does is give me a solid base to work with. One thing you'll notice once I fill in this gnome character is that I go over him again, realizing that I needed to separate the two figures a little bit. So what I do is I paint over him again with a slightly lighter gray, just to help separate those two characters, and then when I go back in to create the shadows and create some of the forms, it makes it a little bit easier to delineate between the two figures. Once I have the general block in place, I create a new layer above that one, set it to multiply, and paint bucket in that entire layer to block in all of the shadows at once. And then I know it looks like I'm using my brush tool, but I'm actually using my eraser. I've turned my Cintiq pen over, and I'm erasing out where the light hits on these figures. And that helps. For me, it makes it easier just to sort of, I don't know, I guess I'm cutting out. Again, it feels like sculpting to me, sculpting out those areas where the light hits or where I want the light to hit. And then I'll go back in with a light brush and paint in some of the finer details, as you will see in just a moment. Now with the shadows in place, I go in on the same layer. I've actually compressed the multiply layer and the regular layer together, just to make it easier for layer management. And I go in with a slightly lighter gray to put in some of the lighter parts of the pig, just to help round him out a little bit, and a little bit on the gnome as well. So again, this is all in the same layer. What I generally like to do is that once I've figured out, like I start a new layer, I'll paint on it. If it feels good, I'll compress it. I'll flatten that with the layer beneath, so I'm working with as few layers as possible. What you'll also notice is that I don't hit any of the really bright hot spots. None of the highlights. I'm only hinting at where the light is coming from. I really like to save some of those hot spots or the really bright stuff until a little bit later on in the process. All right, now we come to the part of the process where we start introducing color to grayscale, and I do this using a combination of different blend modes. Some of the main ones that I use are color, overlay, soft light, and eventually multiply, which is more for enhancing shadows. What you see me doing here, I've basically highlighted the entire pig gnome combination, and I'm just sort of blobbing in some rough hints of color. My opacity is set low, and I have a very soft brush that I'm using. I start to carve out a little bit more of the forms using normal layers as well, but for the most part what I'm trying to do is establish a baseline of color for both of these characters and try to figure out how they'll be unified in the final piece. If it looks like I'm just throwing down color, that's pretty much because I am. I'm trying to figure out what will work the best. But yeah, so right now you can see me working on a normal layer. Eventually I'm going to bounce over to a soft light layer to help brighten up some of those hot spots a little bit. And then after I have all this established, we'll start moving into rendering detail. So for anyone not familiar with where to find the blend modes, I created this little graphic to help illustrate where you can find them right above your layers. And if you have any questions about these, I recommend exploring them at your leisure, playing with them and figuring out what each one does. But if you have any questions, feel free to send me a message. So the one thing you'll notice is that I keep everything very low saturated at this point. I'm sticking to the left half of the palette, generally because I do this pretty much with all of my paintings. I keep it very matte, very low saturation until we start to come to the final bits of the painting, or when I start rendering detail. And the reason being is that if everything's matte, it allows me to select those areas where I really want to punch up the color. So even though you can start to see where some of the areas brighten up, you can see where some of the subsurface scattering will come in on the gnome's ear. Even when I hit the soft light layers, it's still fairly matte. So I wish I could say that this next part was easy or that I had a lot of little shortcuts, but really, this is where you sort of lose the safety net, where you have no lines to guide you. You're sort of covering them up. And this is where the hard part comes in, where you start to render out detail. I've picked a very painterly brush, one that I've been using this entire time. My opacity is set fairly high, not to 100. Some artists will paint at 100 opacity, which is phenomenal to me, but I like to sort of blend my brush strokes together while I work, and this is the easiest way for me to do it. Another thing you'll notice pretty much consistently throughout the rest of the painting is that I color pick directly from the painting itself. Once I've established the colors from using the blending modes. I try to stick with those colors as much as I can, and if I need to introduce new color, I will, but for the most part I try to keep it the palette very limited. Another thing you'll notice is that I've done away with the gray background. You'll see it more when I zoom out, but yeah, I wanted to switch over to a pure white background because I felt it sort of added a nice little contrast between the darkness of the figures. And slowly as I start to paint, I'll build up the contrast on the figures as well, so that they sort of tie in with the background a little bit. Uh, One thing that I'm sure a lot of professional and much better painters than I am will notice is that I am really going in with a tiny brush to render out some of the detail really early on. There's a sort of a painterly rule or a guide that you can follow where they say you start with your biggest brush and then work your way to their smallest brush, and that translates from traditional art to digital art as well, where you get your big brush strokes and you cover everything you need to with the bigger ones, and then slowly work your way down to the detail. I have no excuse. I really wanted to paint this guy's face, and I could not wait. So you'll see me noodling the crap out of his face. And before I start to tackle any details on the pig. But after a while, you'll see me start to bounce around a lot on the painting so that one point doesn't get too far along from the rest of the painting. I try to keep the balance as much as I can while I work. But as many professional artists can attest, there's just gonna come a point where you really want to get in there and paint the details on a specific painting that you're working on. And there's nothing wrong with that. You should feel free. It's your artwork. Do it however you feel works best for you. One thing I think about while painting is obviously keeping track of where my light source is. Uh, the light source in this painting ends up being a little bit vague, but it has a very strong secondary light source that comes from the back, which I'll start to introduce. You can kind of see it on the ridge of the sleeve, but right now I'm introducing it in on the hand, and that becomes a very good focal point, something that I'll focus on throughout, and then introducing that as well into the big old pot-bellied pig. So when I'm designing a character, whether it's for concept art or my own illustration, I try to think of a backstory for them, and that really helps to drive the decisions I make when making designs. I'm a very story-driven artist, and I feel like it adds a little bit more whimsy. It adds a little bit more, um, I don't know, it adds a little bit more body to your work. In this instance, with this little gnome, in considering designing his clothes, I wanted him to look fancy, but not overly fancy. Like he's a farmer. He his coat is maybe one that he wore at his wedding, along with his tuxedo shirt and cummerbund, but he's only ever worn it for special occasions after that. And this contest that he's just entered with his prize hog is um, one of those moments that is very important to him in his life. So as I'm designing the fine details on the clothing, um, I make sure that they're not too polished, too fine. I still want them to look a little bit grubby.
Gospel train is coming. Don't you want to go? Hey, and leave this world of trials and troubles here below. Talk about troubles here below. Let's keep following Jesus. Talk about troubles here below. Let's keep following Jesus.
So you'll notice as we start getting into the rendering on the pig is that oftentimes I'll put down a brushstroke and then I'll paint right over what I just put down. And the reason being is that I spend a lot of time sort of exploring how I want the lighting to feel, how I want to try to sculpt the shapes. And for me, that involves painting over a lot of work that I've already established. I do it a lot on the gnome as well, where there's just parts where I need to paint over little wispy hairs that I put in too early, and then paint them in a little bit later. And it's just a process that I'll follow um, for rendering out form and figuring it out in my head. So here I start to get into more the finer details on the gnome figure. Um, I'm still keeping it fairly loose. I want to create the suggestion of a lot more finer details when you're viewing the painting a little bit farther away. And that's all done with light, just taking one color like a slightly dark green and then painting over it where the light hits with a slightly lighter green. And that seemed to work well for me on this piece. And I'll just go in and noodle out a bunch of details on the coat, into the shirt and cummerbund area as well. And then a lot of those details will travel over into the pig at some point. But as I mentioned earlier, while I'm noodling out these details, I'm hashing out little specifics, the holes in the buttons where the light's hitting, the cuff on the sleeve. I'm sort of creating the story of this character in my head, and it really helps for me to establish a lot of the finer details by knowing who the character is. At some point, I manipulate the bow tie and give it a little bit of gold trim, like it's something that his wife gave him for an anniversary present, and he's very proud of it. So he wears it, like his coat, he wears it at special occasions. If you can come up with a story while you're painting, you'll notice you'll be answering a lot of questions or asking a lot of questions and looking for answers, because painting is a lot of problem solving. So you can be asking questions like, where does this character live? What does he do for a living? What's his family situation like? What are his hobbies besides obviously raising pigs? And who are his friends? You'll be asking yourself these questions and then finding answers for them, and that'll sort of dictate design choices that you make. The more involved the story, the more details you can come up with when designing. So right about here, I start to look more at my reference, and I realize that the reference I'm using, the the picture of the pig that I'm using has spots. He has these large black spots that I kind of like and I kind of want to use in my own piece. But also pigs have a very sort of fine layer of fur that covers their entire body, which a lot of people don't know, or I didn't really pay attention to any of that when I was thinking about this. The way that I solved this problem for this piece was I created an overlay layer and suggested at some of where the spots might be, and then over that one I created a regular layer, and just with a fine brush I started to hash out all the little hairs around the body. It was a very simple, very fast process, and I was able to suggest details without actually going in and really hitting the details hard and making sure that every hair was in place. And throughout the rest of the painting, I will still modify some of those hairs to blend them in a little bit more. But as far as this pig is concerned, I thought that this was a very successful way to create hairs and still be able to see the spots on his skin underneath. If you recall what the final image looked like at the beginning of this video, you'll notice that there was a ribbon. And I didn't know there was going to be a ribbon when I first started painting this. I had no idea what I was doing when I started or where this piece was going to go. So it wasn't until about this point where I decided, oh my gosh, this would be great if he had just won a grand prize for this prize pig. So I started to create this ribbon, and I created the ribbon separately from the painting instead of just painting it right in. And you could do it either way, but this is just what worked for me. Sometimes painting things in perspective is very tricky, so a way that I do it in order to do it quickly, is to make a flat image of a metal or whatever object I need to create, and then manipulate it into place just by using the transform tools on the object. So I'm able to make a unified piece that looks good, and then sort of incorporate that into the painting after it's finished. If anyone has any questions regarding how I use the Bevel and Emboss tool to create this metal, I will be making another tutorial in the near future that goes over that process, as well as how I use Bevel and Emboss to create ornate bits of armor, how I use the transform tool to put those bits of armor in place. So keep an eye out for that. So after placing the ribbon on the pig and trying to get the perspective correct to match up with the two figures, I realized that one of the little tags at the bottom of the ribbon is going the wrong way, and it sort of destroys the illusion of the perspective lining up. It's a simple matter just to cut that out and flip it over and then paint it back in order to blend that ribbon in and make the perspective line up. So here we're getting into the final details of the painting, starting to put in like just the tiniest suggestions of detail, just the little pieces that I think will help to solidify and finalize the piece. At some point, I increased the size of the pig and the gnome so that they fit more within the center of the page, or more within the center of the screen, rather. And when we come to the end with the finer details, it's more just noodling. It's just getting tiny little things that most people won't even recognize. But it's the things that I wanted to put in there that I just for my own satisfaction. At one point, I realized I wanted to put a shadow in there, cast shadow from the pig and the gnome, so it gave him something to stand on, a little piece of ground to stand on, and I sort of, with how I painted, I kind of, backed myself into a corner where I had used white to sort of carve out different shapes, and I had to go back in and erase a lot of those little sections. So that's just another example of sometimes mistakes happen, little problems crop up that you didn't plan for. I didn't know I was going to be putting in a cast shadow until later on, just like I didn't know I was going to be putting in a metal. And those are some of the surprises that you kind of have to deal with when you're painting or when you're concepting. But it's all enjoyable. It's all part of creating a fun painting experience. One thing I nearly forgot to mention, you might be asking yourself, well, Gary, where did those bright highlights come from? Or where did those really bright subsurface scattering parts come from around the pig's snout and the ears? I forgot to mention that. You'll notice that there's a black layer on the top of my image. That is set to a color dodge layer, and then I will go over those really hot spots with a soft brush at a low opacity to pull out a lot of those lights. And I save that generally for the last bits, but I'm going in, you can see I'm going in and re-noodling a bunch of different areas. And that just adds, the really bright highlights that I like in my final pieces, and a lot of the hot spots and subsurface scattering areas that are that you'll find in nature, in the real world. This last layer that I'm putting on is sort of to tie all the colors together and unify the piece. It's a layer set to about 50% gray, and then I'm just using noise filters on it and setting it to overlay and reducing the opacity, and it sort of helps to unify all the colors and finalize the piece. And there you have it. That was my process for painting a pig and a gnome. I'm calling this one Blue Ribbon. And I really hope that you learned something. I hope you enjoyed yourselves along the way. If you did, please subscribe. I'll be uploading new videos covering different subjects, different paintings. I hope you enjoyed yourself. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, send me a message. All of the links to my sites, to my Instagram, are in the description below. And thanks for watching, guys. I hope you had a good time.